I am going to talk about the Labour government between 1964 and 1970, but as I was preparing tonight's talk, it struck me that it would probably be a good idea to go back into the 1950s, partly because I think like lots of people tend to see the 50s and the 60s as the sort of high point of the post-war boom. And in particular, many of the arguments and many of the policies that were going to be developed in the 60s had their origins then. So I tend to see the 50s and the 60s as one period. In fact, in my notes, I have the little note to myself about how do we characterize this period. And the sort of things I'd like people to think about, although I won't be addressing them directly, but it's particularly useful for older comrades who might remember it, and I remember quite a lot of this period, although I was quite young, is that this is obviously the period of the post-war boom. It's the period that's often styled in British politics as "you've never had it so good," although that's a little bit of a misquote, but like all good quotations, it's inaccurate, but it does sum up a truth about the period. It's also a period in which Britain's world role is changing. In 1960, I think something like 12 to 13 African countries received their formal independence from Britain. And you also have in 1956 the Suez Crisis. And of course, what's happening is that Britain's place in the world, its relationship particularly with the United States, but also its role in the Cold War and the Vietnam War in the 1960s will all be, I think, important issues. So the context of Labour Party politics is often what's happening elsewhere. There's also, I suppose, another set of arguments, and when Tina introduced it and said about contemporary resonances, although again, this might be a product of my age, much of this struck me as being quite similar to New Labour, which is going to be one of the final sessions. And in particular, the idea that we'd reached a sort of end of ideology, in particular, the idea of a post-war consensus that was often expressed by a phrase, Butskillism, which was a joining together of R.A.B. Butler, who was a liberal Tory, and Hugh Gateskill. And so the idea that in a sense we were at yet another end of ideology period, and that indeed we were into new types of politics. One thing I also did in preparation for this evening was to read Ralph Miliband's text, Parliamentary Socialism, which again is also interesting because he wrote that initially in the early 1960s, and what he was talking about was in fact fairly contemporary to him. And there's a section there, particularly I think around about pages 330, 340 or so, where he's bemoaning political apathy, political disengagement, and the fact that we're in a new political period. And that's, I think, always a way of alerting as to often the phrases we hear today have often been said before. There's also another area that I'd like to mention, and indeed I can see here that virtually everything I've said would form a talk on its own. And again, I won't really deal with this this evening, but I think it will come up in the next couple of sessions, is of course the wider political context, which is the death of Stalin in the early 1950s, the famous Khrushchev speech in 1956, and the impact that this has on the political left throughout the world, and particularly what starts to emerge increasingly in the 50s and the 60s is what we call the New Left, which really does cover a multitude of groupings, some of them coming out of the Communist Party, some of them coming out of various Trotskyist groups, and some of them will influence the left in the Labour Party, particularly in the 1970s, and I would suggest really up until the present day. So what we have then, I think, is a very interesting period. There's one last point that, again, I'd like comrades to consider, and it really arose from a question that Pat Bernard asked me in one of the earlier sessions, and this is what you might call the political psychology of a period. and in particular the debates that were being held both within bourgeois sociology but also on the left about the impact of the post-war boom, and in particular the discussion about the affluent worker. That was the title of a sociological text which in the 1960s looked at car workers in Luton and suggested that these were new groups of workers whose concerns and attitudes towards class were very different. And many people were suggesting that the working class was in decline, and that indeed conceptions of class, that we were all middle class now. What's interesting about many of these theories was that they came out at not only were very popular amongst the Labour right, but they also appeared just on the edge of an outbreak of industrial militancy in the 70s or the 60s and the 70s, which again alerts us to, you know, rather the importance of avoiding premature obituaries. So I'm going to talk really about the 50s leading up to the Labour government. And the reason why I think this is quite important is that the 50s are in some ways a sort of a framing device for much of the 60s. And in particular, the debates about Labour's policy and about the nature of Labourism, about the relationship between Labourism and socialism are thrashed out. But they're thrashed out around, I suppose, two types of current, which in some ways are not very hard and clear currents, and indeed, you know, in many ways are more sets of attitudes. One of the currents on the left, which is actually quite important, and that is the idea of Bevanism. Now, this was a type of movement that was based around Anaya Bevan, who, as you recall from the last session, had resigned from the Labour government in '51 over the over cuts to the health service. And Bevan, as an individual, became something of a rallying point. He, however, didn't really develop a very clear tendency. There was no organization. There's nothing, for example, of the equivalent of momentum. But he does have he is a sort of a rallying point for the left, particularly in the constituency Labour parties, but also, I think, very importantly, in the unions. One of the sort of themes of the 50s, and again, it has a certain resonance in the last few years in the Labour Party, is that the unions are the home of sensible, moderate people, and that the union bloc vote will come to the assistance of the leadership at a party conference, whereas the constituencies are full of sort of wild left-wingers, extremists. Indeed, given the Cold War atmosphere and the sort of red scares that existed at this time, they're often identified with communists, and indeed the whole attempt to smear people as communist agents and so on is very strong, particularly in the Labour right in that way. The other themes that are increasingly emerging as well, I think, in this debate are the questions of accountability and how far Labour MPs and indeed the Labour leadership should be accountable to the NEC of the Labour Party and to ordinary members, particularly when it's very clear that policies which are adopted at Labour conferences are then are ignored. And indeed, the Labour leadership quite explicitly say, well, you can pass a policy, but we are going to do very little about it. The other current that I want to talk about is the Labour right. Now, the Labour right isn't just in this period, I think, isn't just trade union leaders. It isn't just labourists who want to obtain reforms on behalf of a class interest. There is, I think, a developing sophistication in their arguments. Their arguments, which obviously have their origins in Fabianism and all of the currents that we've looked at before. But from the middle 50s onwards, these arguments turn around whether the old ideas of class, the ideas of conflict in society, whether they still apply, whether they still have any relevance. So people like Hugh Gaitskell, who become something of the standard bearer of this right, Anthony Crossland in his book, The Future of Socialism, began to argue that that the idea of socialism as being either a class-based movement, and indeed of capitalism taking on its form of employer and owner of capital versus the working class, whether these ideas have any relevance. And one policy area where this battle is fought out is actually around the issue of public ownership. And I think it's in this period that the identification of socialism and socialist programs with nationalisation becomes very strong. So there's a sort of a checklist, and delegates to Labour Party conferences are often pressing for the expansion of nationalisation of public ownership of industry, arguing, for example, that without control of industry, without control of the commanding heights of the economy, that a Labour government will be unable to carry out any of its policies, any of its social reforms. The right argue that this is outmoded, and indeed what's important is now efficiency, modernisation, and indeed redistributive forms of taxation, so that the Labour right increasingly regard the 45 government not as the first step towards socialism, but actually as, in a sense, the benchmark. We've actually achieved our limit as far as common ownership or public ownership is concerned, and we're now talking about the balance between the private and public ownership and how the economy will be managed. In particular, the idea of the mixed economy and of entering into partnership with employers, and indeed of developing the relationships in that way, very much modeled, I think, on continental social democracy. It's very plain, for example, that the Scandinavian countries, the sort of ideas that you get in Sweden of the folkhem, the sort of folk community, the idea that, you know, to use a modern phrase, we're all in this together. So it's not so much who owns and controls the economy, it's more a case of how that's going to be organized, the sort of aims of this. Now, these sorts of debates often do take on something of a sharp form, but I don't think we should overstate the sharpness of the debate, and particularly because a point that I've made on a number of occasions, both in response to questions, but I think it is a theme that is starting to emerge, is that both the Labour left and the Labour right have in many senses a sort of symbiotic relationship. They need each other, both in a sense to justify their own position, their own failures, their own successes, but also because, particularly on the Labour left, they see that it's important in their politics to maintain the unity and the loyalty towards the party. So on occasions in the early 50s, an Iron Bevan is suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party. The whips are withdrawn from Labour MPs who, for example, vote against the party policy on defence expenditure and so on. You know, that it's a Tory government, but they're opposed to the programme. Labour isn't. They call for abstentions. So the battles are often quite fierce, and I think in a sense they reveal the limits both of the ideological difference, but they also reveal, I think, some of the limitations. The left is, you know, sees themselves as only having a political role in relation to the Labour Party, which is, you know, it's fine, but they, when push comes to shove, when, for example, there comes to a real battle, they will tend towards compromise, they will tend to, you know, hold up the idea of unity and loyalty to the party in a way in which the right, you know, doesn't always do in a sense when the left is in control. So many of the battles around the Bevanite period actually are, you know, that they're significant, and they're particularly important in terms of the constituencies. But in terms of Bevan himself, he's very much an individual. Much of what he says and much of, reflects a type of instinctive leftism, but he's, he very quickly, I think, comes to heel. And by the late 1950s, when, for example, the issue of nuclear weapons starts to emerge, he has already made his peace with the Labour right. And so, although still seen as a sort of an important, symbol of the left, in many ways his days are past. But there's still enough of an aura of leftism around him, and indeed around many of his followers, such as Barbara Castle and of course Harold Wilson, that this will, this will linger on into the 60s. I have, for example, somewhere in my possession, a letter that my father wrote to Tribune in the early 60s, just after Wilson had been elected, applauding the election and saying that he would take up the banner on behalf of Bevanism, and that when he gets into government, we will see real change. So, I think that sort of aura of leftism that is around Bevan is quite important, but also his attitude, say, to nuclear weapons, and indeed his willingness to compromise with the leadership is also very important. I've talked about some of the ideological differences, and these come up, I think, in a number of areas. The debate over Clause 4, Part 4 in 59 and in 1960, I think, is an important one. Again, because many on the left identify Clause 4, common ownership, with a socialist program. So that's then becomes symbolically very important. But also areas of foreign policy, and indeed from the late 1950s, the issue of nuclear weapons and unilateral nuclear disarmament. The emergence of foreign policy questions is again about the issue itself. Remember that the Cold War and the possibilities of a nuclear strike does hang over people, very much. Again, I was very young in the early 1970s, the early 1960s, but I remember that people talked about this, and indeed the sort of idea that the world could be destroyed very quickly, but with nuclear weapons. So the growth of CND as a mass movement, particularly amongst the young, and particularly amongst those with left-wing affiliations in the Labour Party, is very important. So it isn't just the issue, it becomes, I think, a sort of symbol of opposition, not only to the Labour right, who are of course very closely identified with the pro-NATO position, they're Atlanticists, and you can see that that foreign policy issues, whether those be quite explicitly pro-Soviet or simply arguing for a sort of third way, a sort of neutrality between the United States and the USSR, that pro-Atlanticism, pro-Americanism becomes something of a touchstone for the Labour right. So CND and its successes, for example, at getting unilateralism passed at Labour Party conferences, although it's very quickly reversed, I think is symbolically very important and shows something of the strength of the left and also of its nature. Now, the Labour Party lost the 1959 election, and that defeat, I think, is an interesting one, because in a way it prepares the launch pad for what will be the sort of consolidation of some of the ideological themes I've talked about into the early 1960s. I've talked about the post-war boom, and one of the interesting features of that boom in Britain is the degree of consensus, in the sense that the bourgeois party, the Conservative Party, and the Labour right have about the economic and social development of Britain. One of the expectations that many people had in the 1950s was that after 1951, the Tories would come to power and undo the welfare state. And indeed, I think Labour was rather disappointed when they didn't do that. Now we can debate that question, but what it means is that Labour, that the sort of consensus that Labour built up between 45 and 51 is now the ground on which politics works. So Labour is talking about how to manage that system, bearing in mind that the Tories are, on the basis of the post-war boom and in many other aspects, are carrying out a fairly a one nation policy. If I mention the comrades that in 1955 the Tories built 300,000 plus council houses, you'll have an idea of the nature of that consensus. Even that number of houses now seems unbelievable, and probably younger readers would have to go back and check it's not a misprint to actually build that number of houses in a year. So Labour's political ground and the ground of the Labour right is often shared a great deal in common with the Conservatives, but the line that that Labour does adopt for the 1960s does represent, I think, an attempt to address what are quite fundamental issues in British society, or rather in the British economy. I've talked about the issue of the relative decline of Britain as a world power, and what's becoming increasingly clear by the late 1950s, early 1960s, is that large sections of the British economy either need, really quite important modernization, or indeed a clear reorientation. And this isn't only because Britain is decolonizing and therefore is considering its relationships with the rest of the world. The early 60s are a period when Britain is considering whether to join the European Economic Community. And again, this orientation towards Europe as a market becomes quite important. But also the idea that the British economy's levels of growth, its levels of productivity, and indeed the decline of many of its basic industries mean that some sort of modernization program is important. These sorts of programs were undertaken in the post-war reconstruction of Europe, largely because town planning had been carried out and industrial redevelopment had been carried out variously by the Luftwaffe, the RAF and the Red Army. So there was a need for reindustrialization over large areas of Europe, and that had gone on in the post-war period. In Britain, that process was much slower. But there was also a political angle here as well. And this is where I think the Labour government of the 60s attempts to address what is a widespread demand for some form of modernization. Now, politically, the Labour leadership under Harold Wilson is quite pragmatic. Its orientation or its arguments are that we've now moved beyond the old class-based ideologies and that we're into a new era. And so we get the language of modernity, of progress. Indeed, although the slogan from the 1960s is "Let's go with Labour," and it was had a thumb like this one, and then the "Let's go" underneath it. The document that they produced was called the New Britain, and there was a great deal of emphasis on New Britain, new thinking, and I'm fairly convinced that New Labour lifted a lot of this. In particular, there was a lot of political rhetoric about the old boys network, about the establishment, about the Tories, being a privileged elite living on the grouse moors. The comparison between the old privileged groupings, both industrial and aristocratic, in comparison with the new men, and also the new women as well, because Labour, some prominent women are coming to the fore as Labour politicians, particularly people like Barbara Castle and Jenny Lee. But this idea of modernisation is not a modernisation that, for example, talks about ownership and control. It talks about planning, it talks about reform, it talks about productivity, it talks about science, but this is very much in partnership with the various institutions of British society. Indeed, although Labour, when it comes to power in 1964, has a national economic plan, and it establishes a Department of Economic Affairs, which is designed as a planning department in distinction to the Treasury, and there's a sort of two power bases there, as it were. This does not require much of extension of public ownership. The nationalisation programme is very limited. It requires some planning agreements. It requires some consultations between unions and employers and the government, the National Economic Development Council, the so-called NEDI. So the common picture of those people who watched the news or read the papers in the 60s would invariably a meeting between trade union leaders, business leaders and the government, the so-called beer and sandwiches at Downing Street. And this idea of some sort of national consensus, very similar, I think, to the sort of things that were developing then in continental Europe. So this idea of a new type of politics, a new type of planning and dynamism was very important. But of course, the problems of the British economy were very severe, and they invariably could not be addressed in this way. The 60s are periods of periodic crisis. They often turn around a phrase which is no longer used, but if anybody who is an economist will look at the current British economy and will see a set of figures about the balance of payments between imports and exports and so on, which these figures in the 1960s would have seemed unbelievable. So the fact that the decline of the British economy as an industrial economy, the sucking in of imports, problems of inflation, attempts to deal with this through the devaluation of sterling in 1967, and of course the attempt to initially to get a voluntary policy to control incomes, and then later legally enforced controls over wages with the aim of preventing the trade unions from striking or attempting to defend members' wages in this way. So the issues of the 60s very quickly turn on how the working class can be controlled. And indeed, another phenomenon which will feed into the 70s, and one which all of the sort of reformism of the 50s, early 60s had apparently ushered away, is the re-emergence of trade union militancy. Series of strikes, particularly in those parts of the economy where workers had seen their living standards fall. Perhaps one of the most famous ones is the 1966 Siemens strike, which Wilson attributes to communist infiltration. The phrase "a politically motivated group of men," groups like the teachers, and of course the car workers. All of these strikes are amongst sections of workers who feel that their incomes are being eroded in this period of inflation. There's also something else here as well, which is that these strikes often represent a revolt against the union leaders. Many of the strikes are unofficial, and indeed they're often of what at the time is called a wildcat nature. Workers simply walked out fairly quickly and spontaneously, and indeed it was a sort of national joke, sufficiently for a joke that in many popular comedies, the figure of the shop steward who called his or her workers out on strike, often for fairly trivial things, was an established figure. And that was, I think, a sign of growing working class power, very much a revolt, not only against the Labour government's policies of wage restraint, but also against the type of corporatism that their leaders had tried to develop. So severe was this, as far as the government was concerned, that they attempted to introduce a bill, the Industrial Relations Bill, following their document in place of strife that was introduced by the former Bevanite Barbara Castle. That was defeated, but the issue at the end of the Labour government is very much how will the state deal with trade unions. And why I think this is interesting is that this industrial militancy does feed into the Labour Party. It obviously puts strains on the relationship between the trade union leaderships and the Labour government, but it will also, I think, provide the next layer of people who will come from the unions, often as quite young and inexperienced militants, who will in the 70s start to move into the Labour Party itself. And so that is a clear connection between a left-wing movement in the unions that reflects economic issues and what will be a re-evaluation of the Labour Party and the Labour government in the 1970s. There's one, I suppose, last point that I just want to make in conclusion, and it's really to refer, I think, to the impact of the post-war boom. And again, when we look at Labour's history, we often think of periods of struggle and we think of political developments, and we often think of those as being related to depressions or periods of great crisis. I think what's interesting here, and I think this will feed on into the 70s as well, is that much of these movements and much of this industrial militancy arises from strength and confidence. It arises from, for example, pretty well close to full employment. It arises from a confidence that workers have power and that indeed they're going to use that power. And so the political conclusions from that are not, I think, initially drawn. The Labour left, which does exist and is critical of many of the policies of the government, particularly its relationship, its relationship to the United States, or its attitudes towards the what was then referred to as the common market. There were mobilizing issues for the Labour left, nuclear weapons and so on and so on. But the fundamental economic challenges, I think, will really start to crystallize more in the 70s when Labour next goes into opposition. So I'll leave it there. I have actually got some notes on this, which I will send to Tina, along with a reading list and some primary material. I've had some technical problems today, so I'm not able to email at the moment, but we'll get round to that. So thank you, comrades, and I'll throw it open to questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was fascinating as always. Just to remind comrades, if you want to speak, ideally, if you could press the button that says raise hand, so a little blue hand will show up and then I can take you. 2 to 3 minutes, please. So say 3 minutes. It's a interesting subject, isn't it? We already got a question that I'm reading out from Pat Byrne, who's usually not shy to appear on camera, but I'll read it out. Bevan is famous for saying that socialism is the language of priorities at the 1945 party conference, a phrase that's been used many times by the Labour right to justify their approach. However, I have heard that Bevan's phrase then reads, and the first priority must be the introduction of socialism, which the right usually doesn't read out. Can you confirm this when you come back? Okay, the first speaker from the floor is, hold on, who's this? It is Mike Kennard.
Oh, hi, Mike.
Hiya, Kevin. Yeah, I remember your uncle. He was a Blairite before Blair. Two issues. First of all, the question of Britain's international role and the sort of frantic attempt of a declining capitalist power to maintain its influence throughout the world, and the cost of that to the economy. Because if you look at what happened in Europe, the country that was most devastated, the Luftwaffe were fairly effective, but nowhere near as effective as the RAF and the American Air Force in destroying capacity. Germany rebuilt, with martial aid obviously, rebuilt its industrial capacity, and but because of the rules imposed on them after the war, they were not allowed to develop an armaments industry.
Mhm.
Consequently, they dominated the world in automotive and other engineering fields, electrical engineering in particular. And meanwhile, Britain was chasing this fantasy, or British capitalists were chasing this fantasy, but failing, diverting huge amounts of resources. You know, just thinking in particular of the independent nuclear deterrent and Blue Streak, the missile program that was abandoned at the behest of the Americans. Set back Britain's British capitalism's industrial renewal by decades, in fact, probably irrevocably. The second issue is probably the flight of capital, because I think in particular of, you know, I'll give an example of the cement industry. As you probably know, the Medway Valley and much of North Kent is pockmarked with quarries and former cement works.
Mhm.
Now, there was a consolidation of smaller cement companies into the Associated Portland Cement, which became Blue Circle, and the profits they were making were basically funneled straight out of the UK into primarily the USA. So you had this sort of situation where British capitalism was failing to get up of its knees because it was pushing money abroad, and I think the Wilson government came in to a very, very difficult situation.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, even the Labour left was enthralled to this imperialist delusion. I remember after 1966, I wrote my first serious involvement in active politics, apart from running numbers from the polling stations and that sort of thing, was to Anne Kerr, the Tribunite member for Gloucester and Chatham. And I wrote to her asking her to support Britain's withdrawal from NATO. And this is an organised lefty, and she balked at that prospect. So I mean, it's just this question really of imperialist delusions, defence delusions, essentially wasted expenditure, plus the flight of capital. And the Wilson government, to be fair to them, came into a pretty dire situation, and they did make some attempts to improve matters, but they were facing the very sluggish and self-interest and recalcitrant capitalist class.
Thank you, Mike. Can I remind people to introduce themselves?
Oh, sorry, Mike Kennard, Cambridge North East Cambridgeshire CLP, formerly Rochester and Chatham, as Kevin well knows.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll bring in Pauline next. 3 minutes, please. Thank you. And could you introduce yourself as well, please, Pauline?
Hello, I'm Pauline Fraser. I'm from Worthing West CLP. Hello, Kevin. I just wanted to pick up on the fact that you explained, quite a lot about the political consensus in the 50s and 60s, etc., and the growing militancy of the working class in the 60s and 70s, and that they were coming from a position of strength, quite different, of course, from the present situation where unions have halved their memberships since the 70s. And what I don't think you really mentioned particularly was the economic context to this, which was that the at that period, in the late 60s and 70s, you talked about never have had it so good and so forth, and that was Macmillan's slogan, I seem to remember, in the 59 election. But there was actual concrete reason for this, in that workers' share of GDP was at the highest that it has ever been, I believe, ever been, you know, since there was a working class, and that clearly had a big effect, and the capitalists must have been, you know, bells must have been ringing of danger, and they wanted to put a stop to this, which of course it was stopped very, very suddenly and abruptly and horribly, as many of us remember, with the defeat of the last Labour government and Margaret Thatcher coming into power. Okay, if you could maybe talk about that a bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline. Andy Phipps just moved away from his camera. Shall I take, there you are. Okay, I'll bring you in. You're back. Hello, can you introduce yourself briefly, please?
I can't imagine why you thought I wanted to speak, but I'll give it a go. Yeah, I was born in 1950, and it's something me and my wife talk about this period, that undoubtedly I think the position of the working classes had bit by bit grudgingly improved. We were laughing about the tins of Nescafe and tins of cream and stuff, and still as children living in houses where we had windows frozen up on the inside in the morning, that kind of stuff. You know, the old Monty Python sketch, you know, luxury. We have, I feel, improved, and I remember, you know, I think Gateskill was the first leader that I could remember, and grudgingly, bit by bit, we've watched the struggle go up and down. I feel that we've come to what now, it's highly relevant to think about this time, because we now, I think we stand on the threshold of what could be a massive downturn for people, and the lessons that we have to learn from what Kevin's told us are very important. That's basically all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Jules, do you want to speak? Then you would need to switch on your camera. If not, I'm bringing in Charlie.
Hello, no, hello. No, I'm a bit shy. I don't want to speak tonight.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Okay, fair enough. Sorry, Jules? No, sorry. I was trying to get Jules to speak. Hold on, why can't I?
Educational environment, and I know it's safe.
Hello there.
That it is safe, and I think that's what we're working with right
Hello.
now. That there is not a feeling of safety amongst parents.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure who's talking there now. Jules, do you want to try again?
Hi there. I'm a bit too shy to talk tonight. Okay.
Okay, fair enough. And we've got some background noise there. Okay, Charlie, then you're next. Fire away.
Hello there, Charlie Pritchard from Norwich South CLP. I just wanted to talk about how, like, the sort of the Wilson government in the long-term context of the decline of British capitalism, in order to, like, explain, like, the sort of the backtracks on the promises made in the manifesto for, like, austerity measures. You know, prescription charges reintroduced, wage restraint, interest rates on mortgages and on homes increased, and so forth. Just after the election, Lord Cromer approached Wilson demanding all-around cuts to be made to government expenditure, telling him that the country couldn't afford Labour's programme. So it was with the Wilson government that I think you kind of started to see some of the cracks opening up in the Keynesian model, which, you know, a process that kind of culminated, many sort of economic stories here, like in the crisis of 1974. And the independence of the colonies meant that Britain no longer had the markets of the empire to fall back upon with cheap labour, and with the ruling class failing to modernise home production, such as steel and, you know, shipbuilding, that allowed, and essentially allowing industries to rot at home. And now Britain was being constantly outstripped by her competitors in the world market in steel production, dropping to being sort of only like, the fifth largest producer of steel. And the growth of Russia in steel production demonstrated the superiority of the planned economy. But nevertheless, the funneling of capital into the armaments industry, which was reaping huge profits despite the products becoming almost sort of obsolete once they came off the production line. Being sold in support for military endeavors like the Vietnam War revealed a desperation with which British capitalism was trying to settle for a new status on the world scale, acting as a partner to American imperialism. And indeed, like Wilson surreptitiously provided little more than just moral support to America. Britain secretly sold arms to the United States for use in Vietnam with clandestine deliveries of weapons, including napalm and 500-pound bombs from Hong Kong. And on the subject of what you were discussing in the last session on the 1945 Labour government, on the nationalisation of industries, again, you find the implementation of nationalisation as a means of modernising failing industries, but to the benefit of the capitalists themselves. The only reason the Labour government, nationalised steel in 1967 was, well, the prime reason was to provide cheap steel to big business. If you only have a minority of the key industries of the country nationalised, it will always be dictated by the demands of the majority in private hands. So we see the failures of the Fabian vision of socialism, of nationalisation by nationalisation, which implicitly accepts compromise as a strategy rather than taking hold of the commanding heights of the economy in one fell swoop. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Charlie. I've got one question to read out from Ben Kavanagh. What effect did the presence of the USSR and the universal services in the USSR have on workers in this period? We touched on that in the last session, but Red Thread certainly covered that period as well. I'm going to bring in two more speakers from the floor before I bring you back, Kevin, because there's quite a lot of people already wanting to indicate and have indicated to speak. So Rick Simon is the next speaker from the floor. Can you please introduce yourself, please?
Hi everybody, Rick Simon, Nottingham East, CLP and Nottingham Labour Left Alliance. I think one of the reasons why there's a lot of people want to speak is that certainly the older members can remember this period and in various ways. Obviously I think I'm a similar age to you, Kevin, slightly older. So, but I do remember if you like, the hope and optimism that surrounded this particular period. So I think one of the questions I would have is, to what extent do you think that Wilson did represent something different from the previous Labour leadership, especially Gateskill? Of course, Wilson had always been associated with, as you say, with the Bevanite left of the party, but one thing that just doing some preliminary reading for this, Perry Anderson, writing in before the Labour government was elected in 1964, said that he thought that the thing that really differentiated Wilson from Gateskill was that Gateskill took that issue about the affluent worker and so on, and believed that the only way forward really for the Labour Party was to promise more and more consumer goods in order to meet the needs of this increasingly affluent working class. Whereas Wilson actually had a strategy for modernisation. And that there's a famous, a quote from Wilson that he uses an example of how he thinks this strategy was going towards the development of a technical intelligentsia almost, and that this intelligentsia was very much at odds with the old Tory aristocratic type of industry and society that had existed previously, and that the traditional working class, if you like, was pushed into the background by Wilson, and and there's a talk about the Labour Party becoming the party of the sort of the scientific white coats rather than the cloth cap. While other people, obviously, in retrospect and in hindsight, we can see that the amount of change was rather more limited. Do you think that that there was a promise of more change at the beginning? And sorry, the second question relates to the what you say about the back end of the 60s and the defeat of the Labour government in 1970. You say about trade union militants going into the Labour Party, but I think also there were a lot of other militants from different areas of society, if you like, that emerged in the late 1960s, particularly influenced by the events in France, in Italy, and so on, were community organisers, the emergence of movements around, obviously, women's liberation, black liberation, and so on, that also found their way into the Labour Party in the early 1970s to help to create the Bennite left that then emerged. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rick. Last person before I bring back Kevin is Carmen. I'll unmute you now. Hello.
Hi, thank you, Kevin. I want to touch on something that you haven't touched, that is during the first Wilson government, then it was, the British state sent a military intervention into Northern Ireland, and the effect that has, because Northern Ireland is still looming very, a lone shadow on Corbyn, for example. Corbyn was portrayed as friend of terrorists because of his support towards democracy in Ireland, because I don't think that it has been explained what was the situation in terms of democratic deficit in Northern Ireland when in the 60s and indeed until the 70s, only the head of the household and his wife were able to vote. It wasn't universal suffrage like in the rest of Britain, and also the discrimination in terms of Irish Catholics, having access to housing, having access to jobs, and this hasn't been explained. And during, the Corbyn period, the links between Corbyn and Irish nationalists were exploited against Corbyn, and this arise for the intervention of the Wilson government in Ireland by sending an army intervention to support the Catholics, but it really degenerates. And it wasn't what it's supposed to be. It was never explored. And I find that the Labour Party failed in explaining the situation in Ireland by pointing out that Corbyn was right all along, that the solution to the Irish trouble was political and not militarily, and then the Good Friday Agreement, despite all the problems in Stormont, after 20 years, they still hold. And I would like to explore that. If you have a comment on that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carmen. Bringing back Kevin for 5 minutes or so.
Okay, thanks. Pat, I can't confirm that. It does sound accurate, but I only know the opening quote, so I haven't had time to check it. So there's always one question, and thank you for asking it. Okay, so I can't confirm it. Just on Mike's points, it's good to hear you again, Mike. It's a long time. I think you're quite right about the way that British capitalism, with its arms expenditure and its international role, that this was a hobbling factor. In fact, from the middle 60s, the idea of withdrawing from east of Suez does become quite important. So I think that some attempt to sort of address that issue, and I think that in the long term, the debate in the early 60s about the orientation towards Europe, is part of that factor. So I think you're right that you know, in the words, I think, of Dulles, the American Secretary of State, you know, that Britain has lost an empire and hasn't found a role, and it was still trying to keep that role up. If you just look at the number of military bases around the world, you look at the size of British armaments, and of course the nuclear weapons, although those nuclear weapons, you know, as many people argued at the time, were really just an adjunct to the American armaments because of the control in that way. And your points about German modernization, and indeed Japanese modernization, I think is well taken as well. I think perhaps a more interesting question, and it does link into some of the other questions about why the British capitalist class carried on as they did, why, for example, they didn't modernize. I think to a certain extent there's an imperialist hangover. Quite a lot of investment goes into what I refer to as the invisibles in things like insurance and banking. There's still established networks, and I think the belief amongst many people was that the links with the former colonies through the Commonwealth, that these could all be ways in which Britain could retain its world investments. So there is, I think, something of a time lag, but on any rational policy, British capitalists should have just cut their losses. But again, you know, not all capitalist classes, like all human beings, are as rational as they should be. Your point about flights of capital, capital controls, these are all, I think, again, they're things which now seem, you know, from a distant age, but the use of capital controls and flights of capital, particularly to put pressure on sterling and in that way on the government, you know, Wilson's attacks on the gnomes of Zurich, you know, is an example of that. I thought your point about the Tribunettes is an interesting one, and I didn't realise Anne Kerr had not supported withdrawal from NATO. So although in my family people always had a very high opinion of her, and in relation to the last speaker, Carmen Anne Kerr, who was a British Labour MP for a dockyard town which had a lot of military people in it, both as voters and people who were employed in that sort of area, and actually actively participated in civil rights demonstrations in Northern Ireland. She was actually in Derry in October 1968. But I think the limitations of the Tribunettes, and in particular their wariness of being associated with the Soviet Union, and indeed of stepping outside of the consensus, I think you know, comes in there in that way. I think what's interesting about this period, and one of the comrades referred to Perry Anderson, is the sort of hangover of imperialist delusions. And you know, if you think say about 1960, it's you know, it's the year when a lot of places are decolonizing, Britain's withdrawing from them, and it is relatively recent, you know, in as far as the British capitalist class are concerned, since they've had to make that reorientation. And so I think that there will inevitably be a time lag. But you know, if I was advising the British ruling class, I would have told them to have cut it a lot earlier. Pauline, on again, so a good point there about the share of GDP that went to the working class, and in particular the counterattack by the capitalists. I hope I did make it plain that the working class was in a strong position, with pretty well near full employment. You know, my own memories, although admittedly I was very young, and maybe I'm thinking more of the late 60s and the early 60s, but work was reasonably plentiful, and it was quite possible for people to change jobs. And indeed, it was also quite possible for unions to build up their membership, particularly in the more profitable industries. And again, I think the change between that position in the 60s and really anything that we have today, or indeed I would say anything that we've had since the late 1970s, I think is very important. And that then is going to affect political psychology in that way. Andy, yeah, I quite like the Three Yorkshiremen sketch. And even those of us who are from the Medway towns, we also had ice. But then I'm sure that the winters were colder and that life was generally more miserable at that time. So the differences, I think, in life are important. And for many people, they could see material benefits emerging in the 60s. And although some of that was often linked to a sort of natural progression, almost that capitalism was a sort of conveyor belt and you just sat on it and you went along and things got better. There was also an argument that, you know, particularly in those groups of workers who were falling behind, that the only way you got anything was to fight for it. And an area which I'm quite well aware of in teaching, that the late 60s see some of the first teacher strikes, national teacher strikes, because the pay of teachers and indeed other groups of white collar workers are falling behind. Older participants will remember the word differential and the way that groups of workers often benchmark their pay in relation to other groups of workers. And so I think that that idea that a degree of militancy paid off, I think does, you know, is very common. So the strikes often occur not from the well-organized sections of the working class who were able to negotiate from a position of strength. It was often groups of workers who had been previously quite weak. Charlie, I think again your contribution on the long-term decline of British capitalism, I'd agree with much of that. I think the point about Keynesianism, and I think this will come up next week in the points about the 1970s, is that all over Europe, Keynesian methods of demand management and of control of the economy are starting to be questioned. Indeed, Jim Callaghan, who became the chancellor in the late 60s, is already talking about that there will need to be some sort of change to the basic assumptions of Keynesianism. And he's doing this even, I think, in the late 50s, early 60s, when it looks like he's going to become chancellor. He starts to investigate this. So already in many ways, the sort of writings on the wall for that, you've never had it so good, demand management period in that way. And your point about the way that nationalisation and indeed state intervention was a way of propping up parts of the capitalist economy in that way. Ben, your point on the USSR, I think, is very important, and I think it's particularly important in the 1940s and 50s that American imperialism and British imperialism as well is very well aware not only of the military power of the USSR and the possibilities that in a military conflict it would be able to expand. I mean, I think there's debate about that, but strategically they believe that might be possible. But I think the important point was that something which, again, in the post-1989 world, although China, you know, could be said to fulfill part of that role, but I think it's not as explicitly committed to an alternative model of society in the way that the USSR was, does represent something of a pole of attraction, you know, and the memories of the war, our gallant Soviet allies, as the phrase goes, but also the idea that capitalism was not the only way to do things. And even if, for example, people disagreed about its nature or whether it really was as efficient, you know, and so on and so forth, there was still another way of running an economy, of running society. So that's quite important. Just very quickly on the last point, Rick's point about Wilson and Gateskill, I think it's an interesting one. And in preparation, I was looking at some sort of contemporary readings of Wilson, and I think opinions were divided. For example, there's some division about how well prepared that government was, whether there was a very clear plan. In other words, that the sort of use of the word planning actually hid a lot of inefficiency, and indeed often the targets were simply aspirations that were drawn up. So although Wilson actually talked about hitting the ground running and we've got a plan that's ready to go and so on, I think there's some debate whether that actually is actually did occur. I think the key difference though is a matter of style, in that Wilson does represent what C.P. Snow in the 1950s refers to as the new man, or the new men, the technocrats, the scientists, and indeed these are sort of almost non-class, and it contrasts science and modernity, a type of classless politics, with both the upper class and also, I'd argue, with the idea of the trade unionist as a cloth-capped man who has restrictive practices. So why it reminds me of Blair is that language of modernity, and indeed that idea of class division sort of almost dissolving in modernity. I think Gaitskill's own personal background was much less that. Wilson, for example, had been a bureaucrat during the Second World War. His father was an industrial chemist, and although he often played the sort of common man, he smoked a pipe, he publicly used expressions from soccer, talked about his preferences for HP sauce and other things. He was in practice, fairly middle class, but he was probably one of the first people to sort of grasp the PR aspect of trying to appear classless in that way. Your point about the impact of 68, I think that's a little later. I think quite a lot of people on the left, the sort of 68 generation, probably got involved in the Labour Party slightly later than 68 itself. But, that's probably just a slight difference of emphasis. And then lastly, Carmen, I've actually written quite a lot on Labour in Northern Ireland, and I'll make some suggestions to you. I didn't mention it. It was actually the second Wilson government, well, technically, because troops were sent in August 1969. And I think Labour's relationship with Ireland, and indeed what was going on there, would warrant a whole session. And I'm not volunteering for it, but I can make some suggestions of things where I've written about this, which is actually my main academic area, rather than what I've been talking about, for the last couple of weeks. But you're quite right. It was an important sort of test case, particularly for some of Labour's ideas on the modernisation of the British state, and also its understanding of how and the role of government, the role of a Labour government in that state. But I'll leave it there.
I have a feeling we'll be overrunning today. But can I ask comrades to keep to 3 minutes, please, in their contributions now. I'm taking Harry next. Could you introduce yourself briefly, please?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Harry from Northern Ireland Labour Party. I actually thought the session was over, so I was about to go off there. No, it's just, Kevin, you mentioned there that a number of countries gained independence in this period from Britain, which must have, after the war, Britain's, strategic role, of course, diminished quite significantly, particularly with the carve-up between America and Russia. I'm just interested to know is that those countries, I think you said about 12 countries had gained independence. Did that have any real significance in the economic influence, or should I put it, the wealth coming into Britain? Did that have any distinctive factor in Britain becoming degenerating in a place, of a world economic power in that period? Did that independence play a role of that as those countries gained it in this period? And I think we've seen ever since, you know, a slow decline in Britain's economic influence throughout the world. So it's the question on independence. Okay.
Thank you. Roy Wenborn is the next speaker, please. I'm unmuting you now. Oh. Sorry, Comrade.
I didn't ask to come in, Tina.
Sorry, now we can hear you, yeah.
No, I didn't ask to come in.
Oh, you didn't?
I don't know where that come from.
No, you just, okay, sorry then. Matthew then, please.
Hi, yeah, no, there's a whole lot in this. Obviously, you know, a whole decade of enormous changes. I think that, I mean, from what people sort of, there's been some good contributions. I think that the primary thing, obviously, is the prolonged unwillingness of the British ruling class to actually invest in industry, which went on over a whole period. I think, you know, really, he starts to come out in this decade, and then obviously the effort of, you know, Wilson government in particular, as well as the Tories, in fact, Macmillan and so on, to reorganise British industry. I mean, I suppose you talk about, you know, Macmillan's effort and so on, to, you know, building of Ravenscraig, building of Linwood in the west of Scotland. You know, Wilson basically creating British Leyland as this vast, great, you know, trying to tie together the bulk of the British car industry into this one great conglomerate, which did vast numbers of other things besides cars. But at the same time, I think also the development to the left. I mean, the key really, I think, is also is the split in the Communist Party in '56 and the emergence of Trotskyism as being the leading force among, I mean, certainly of the newer layers of militants as they came into action in the '60s. That you've got, you know, Trotskyism managed to seize that lead, and you didn't have the domination of Stalinism that you did have in the rest of Europe. And this thing comes up, and it comes in, it creates these issues within the Labour Party. You know, so you have the dissolution of the Young Socialists, for instance, in, what was it, 63, 64, precisely because of the domination of the Trotskyists. And then you have obviously the effort to control the militancy of the working class through things like in place of strife. And you know, talking to comrades who were there, I mean, I'm too young, but comrades who were there did speak of one of the things about the Labour Party, of course, of being through the decade, was, of course, it was a mass organisation at the start of the decade. And by the end of the decade, vast numbers of people left, you know, either because, you know, they didn't see the point of being the damn thing, or because they were seriously pissed off by the actions of the Wilson government. You know, comrades who were there at the time described to me that, you know, sort of, you got to the point where there was almost nobody in the damn thing by the time you got to 1970, from a position where it had almost street by street organisation. You know, I mean, I think it's different in different areas. And obviously in Glasgow, where I am, the CP did predominate in terms of the organisation of the left for decades. Fortunately not now. But, you know, and it's that as you say also is that movement of the you know, within the class in terms of an emergence of a militancy throughout. I mean, notably obviously the car industry, but you know, also getting down to the point where you have, say, the surface workers strike among the miners. The miners have taken no action at all since before or very little action since the Second World War, and suddenly you have the most oppressed, ground down, least well paid, least well organised section of the NUM deciding to walk out unofficially, which really jangled. I mean, the NUM, if you ever dealt with it, was a very, very hierarchical organisation. The surface workers are right at the bottom of that, and suddenly they walked out and started closing down the whole coalfields, particularly Yorkshire. It was a major shock to the whole thing, and it was a sort of precursor to the strikes of the 70s. You know, so you have a big upsurge in the British working class, as well as around Europe, particularly in France. You know, and also, of course, the Prague Spring as well, an upsurge in the working class even in Stalinist countries. You know, so I mean, in those terms, I mean, a decade of major changes, and which then changed also the politics how the working class, it's you know, the sort of political organisations, you know, that you've got an emergence of a whole new set of political organisations, rather than just purely you know, the Labour Party itself, and that's how it, you know, how it worked through the 70s.
Thank you, Matthew. Bring in Liv next. She's from Brighton, Labour Left Alliance. I'll unmute you now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi,
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Liv Singh from Brighton, LLA. Yeah, I wanted to say something about the rapid change in society at this time, because I think it does have actually quite an enormous effect and impact on how the working class sees itself now and how it's seen itself, well, since that time. So in addition to what we've been talking about, which is largely the economy and industry, this is a time of enormous change. I mean, you think it's the start of rock and roll, you know, which has actually had a big impact on the working class. But, you know, you also look at the living conditions of people. I mean, I was born during this period, and I know that the house that I was born in had no running water. And so, you know, this is a period of time from the early 1950s, when council housing really starts to take off, through to the 1970s, which was really the high point of council house building. So you're seeing people moving out of homes which were cold, damp, overcrowded, no running water, no central heating, into, you know, spacious, well-planned council housing. This had an enormous impact, I think, on people's lives. Their living conditions are really quite, you know, are fundamentally changed in this period. Education as well. If you look at education, at the start of this period, people were leaving school at, you know, 13, 14. By the time you get into the early 1970s, it's 16. And not only school, but you're seeing working class kids going to university. I'm one of them, you know, first in my family to go to uni. So you're seeing really quite rapid change in so many areas of working class people's lives. And this, I think, has had an impact on how people see themselves now. When people look back at the homes that they were, you know, born into, they can see that change, obviously in a way that young people can't, because those houses, those housing conditions of the early 1950s and even through to the early 1960s, they've gone. Slum clearance did away with all of that, essentially. And also, of course, consumer society. I mean, it's been touched upon, but again, it's massive impact. When you think of car ownership, when you think of refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, I mean, these things have a massive impact on people's lives and on how they live. The other point I wanted to make was in terms of when the Labour government won the election, the early 60s, and when they came in, it's also worth remembering what was happening with the Tories at that time as well. You've had the Profumo affair, remember? You had the T. Dan Smith scandal of corruption in local government construction. So it's interesting how, you know, Tory sleaze is coming before a Labour government, which of course we've seen again, you know, before Tony Blair came in the 1990s. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Our last speaker from the floor is Pat Byrne. Hello.
Thanks, Tina. You issued a challenge there, so I responded.
I thought I might.
Well, first of all, to say my name is Pat Byrne, Labour International Left Alliance, based in Brazil. And a great introduction by Kevin. I think everyone would agree that. And in fact, I wish it could have been longer because there's so much things that he wasn't able to cover. And a great discussion too. my own personal history, and as the comrades have said, we start to get into an era where we can actually talk from personal experience, unlike the previous sessions. And I first got involved in the Labour Party when I was 10 in 1964, giving out leaflets for the Labour Party in the Wilson election. And my parents allowed me to stay up all night because the election was on a knife edge. And that was my first experience of staying up all night. And it was incredibly exciting. I mean, the 60s were an amazing time. You had this explosion of youth culture, the swinging 60s in Carnaby Street and all that kind of thing. We won the World Cup. I remember that very well. But these were all kind of played into the mood of the times. And Wilson was actually, coming from the left, Wilson was a far more intelligent politician. And he used the first period of government, when he had only won with a majority of 3, the first 2-year government he ran. He ran it pretty, you know, from a populist perspective, from what I remember.
Yeah.
And he was able to turn it into a 100-seat majority in the 1966 election. Maybe Kevin can comment on the difference between the two governments. But sadly, after that point is when he started backsliding, most notably, and under the pressure of the economy and the establishment, and he started backtracking on a lot of his promises. Incidentally, by the way, Wilson smoked cigars, but he smoked a pipe in public to cultivate this working class image, but privately he really smoked cigars. He hated the pipe. He never actually had it lit most of the time, or he lit it and then he wouldn't smoke it. Now, there was a question about the workers, you know, the workers, embourgeoisement of the workers, it was called, the workers becoming capitalists. And like I commented on the thing in the 19th century, it was a load of rubbish. I was brought up in the print union, and I went to my first union meeting at 11 with my mum. And I knew the print workers very well, and they were regarded, they were very well, highly paid, and they were regarded as typifying this kind of development. But they were so militant that they knew they got their money because of the union. And so the management couldn't come down on the factory floor without accompanied by a shop steward. If any manager was seen on the print shop floor, instant strike. All the workers just walked out. They weren't allowed to even walk on their own. And even among the office clerks and the secretaries, my mum was one of them, the shop steward came and sorted out any problems if the windows, if someone was complaining the windows were open too much, the shop steward came and did it. Not the manager wasn't allowed to do that. And the same was true for the car workers. They were claimed to be the bought-off workers, but they were going on strike every week. I mean, it was ridiculous. I wanted to ask a question of Kevin, finish here. The one thing he didn't, of course, he couldn't cover everything, but one important influence I think that it'd be interesting to hear his comments on was the influence of the CIA and the Americans, because the CIA had been set up at the end of the 40s, and then when Dulles took over, Alan Dulles took over in 51, he was a vicious far-right political figure who'd worked with the Nazis during the war, and he set about interfering in political developments all over Europe and elsewhere, and he was financing the right wing in the labor movement and arranging for them to go to trips to America. So a lot of the developments that took place on the right of the labor movement weren't just chance. I mean, some of them were obviously developed because of the situation, but they were also influenced by, I think, by the Americans and their intervention because they were trying to steer their allies in what they regard as a favourable direction. I hope Kevin could comment on that. Thanks for it.
Thank you, Pat. Kevin, there's another question I read out to you from Mike Hogan. Do you not think the series of betrayals from the Bevanites was a result of their lack of program and failure to see beyond capitalism? There you go. You got 10 minutes.
Okay. Thanks, comrades, for some good questions as ever. First of all, Harry, I think I think where Britain sort of gained was in terms of decolonization was obviously the direct costs, you know, particularly in Kenya in the latter years with the Mau Mau movement and having to station troops and pay actually for the administration. In terms of economic influence and investment and markets and so on, much of that wealth did continue, but of course in the succeeding 50 years or so, many of those countries have shifted themselves, they've developed their own industries, and many of the historical links between Britain and those countries have faded, particularly when Britain joined the European Economic Community. And so, you know, in that way, the exact sort of profit and loss, I think, is hard to equate. But I think you know, the benefits were initially just in that area of administration, and also in terms of political opprobrium. Remember that this is a period of decolonization across the world, and I think that's quite important to note, that the idea of empire was under threat, you know, throughout the world. Sorry, I've had a technical problem. All right, okay, I'm back on again now. Just on Matt's point, I mean, there were some quite interesting points there. Certainly about the decline in Labour membership, I think that is true, that there were declines, although it did vary. And in many places, Labour membership had really been in decline from the 50s. Your point about industrial militancy, and indeed the nature of the left, I think isn't entirely accurate, or indeed is not entirely uniform. I think that in many trade unions, the militant trade unionists were often organized around the CP, Communist Party, and indeed there were CP supporters in the leadership of trade unions, and often people who joined unions, became militant, gravitated to the Communist Party. I'm thinking particularly in areas like the docks and the car industry. So I wouldn't entirely agree that the new Trotskyist groups, for example, in the 60s, necessarily formed the dominant group. I'd say that it was probably different in different regions, and I think much of that sort of slippage, if you want to think of it like that, occurs more in the 70s. But even so, I think well into the 70s and maybe into the 80s, it's a generational question, but there will still be a network of members of the Communist Party who formed the sort of core of industrial militants. So I think your reading there isn't entirely accurate. But I think one of the things about many of these developments is that they take place at different speeds and in different places. You know, for example, many of the new left that one of the last comrades referred to do start to move into the Labour Party in the from the early 70s, some from the later 70s, and some even as late as the 80s. So I think that, there are different processes occurring both in terms of, regions and areas and so on. I think the point, Matt, that you made about attempts to modernize British industry, and that this being a sort of national consensus, I think is very useful, because in that way, both the Labour government of the 45-51 period and indeed Wilson later on is, they are perceived as radical and as challenging the establishment, but they're also working as part of a recognized idea that Britain does need to modernize, that industry is, outdated, that investment does need to be stepped up. It's just a debate about how this is going to be done. I mean, probably what we will start to see when we look at the 70s and 80s is a sense that this can't be done. And so we're talking about a reorientation of British capitalism towards other areas, finance, services, in other words, giving up the ghost almost of industry in that way. One other thing that struck me about your international references, and again, I have made a note of it on my typed notes, is that international politics, both in Europe itself, but also throughout the world, the Cuban Revolution, events in Algeria, the war in Vietnam, which I think is really central, and I hardly touched on it, but that's going to have a very big impact on how people see politics. I think particularly around that sort of Atlanticist argument about the relationship of Britain and the United States. You know, demonstrations against that war and the idea of keeping Britain out of that war, I think, are quite important on the Labour left, and indeed in the left in British society generally. Liv, I concur generally with what you're saying, and again, I had made a note of it, and when I talked about social change, I was trying to sort of summarize all of the things that you say. But I think there's one important point about social change, and indeed improving living standards and improving opportunities. For many people, and again, we might want to talk about this in succeeding sessions, we often argue that real political change occurs when the working class is at its lowest ebb, and indeed there are some sort of rather catastrophist theories that sort of argue that if the working class gets a series of defeats, they'll become radicalized. Well, you know, there is, I think, a counter argument, which is often that if people are constantly being defeated, then not only will they not fight, but they will become demoralized. And I think one of the interesting things in this period is that far from buying off the working class and, you know, making them, you know, affluent workers who are just concerned about their own individual interests, I think that it creates a degree of confidence, and the type of confidence that Pat describes in terms of workers' power on the shop floor. So that I think we've got to look at these things as not always being as clear cut, so that alongside the youth culture and alongside rock and roll and alongside all these social changes, there's also a growing confidence in being working class. In terms of popular culture, if you think about the typical character of that period, the bright working class lad and woman who isn't going to take any lip, indeed challenges the system. You know, you think of the various spies played by Michael Caine and so on. All of these characters, or the working class literature, which shows the working class as, you know, standing up for itself. You know, I can think of a whole host of films and books from that period which sort of exude that confidence. And I think that has all sorts of political impacts. The sleaze question in the early 60s is interesting, although I think the revelations about Poulsen and so on occur later on. I think that starts to unfold, I think, in the late 60s, and in fact it's the 70s when they become an issue, but I'm just working from memory there. And then lastly, just on Pat's question about the differences between the two governments, I think in a way that the tightness of discipline of having a small majority, you know, did help Wilson maneuver and control his party. But I think also that the economic situation really does, you know, become much worse, you know, in that later period, post 66. The devaluation is in November 67, and I think that in a way what Labour did was to get a number of rescue packages and increasingly rely upon American aid and so on. So I think in a way the chickens did really come home to roost, which no amount of management, you know, could really deal with, which is why the Heath government's policies of Selsdon, Mann and taking, and, you know, attempts to cut public expenditure have already been prefigured. Your point on the right and the role of the CIA, I think, is an interesting one. I think it's true. There's one thing though I would be careful on, and I'm not accusing you of it, so please. I think it is important to note that the Atlanticists, as they were called, the pro-NATO groups, people like the Campaign for Democratic Socialism, were receiving that sort of assistance. And it's also clear that there were other types of, you know, penetration. You know, there were a number of revelations, I think, in the 70s and 80s about that. So I think that's taken as read. but I think we have to be careful of anything that tends towards conspiracy. The Labour right had its bastions in the unions and in the constituencies. And although we know that large number of the trade union leaderships were connected with British intelligence, and that indeed, even if they weren't, you know, consciously working in that way with the intelligence services, they certainly saw their politics as being bound up with opposing militancy. So I think that it's probably that we should focus on as much as on, you know, blaming the CIA. But they did have a role, and that was revealed, I think, increasingly in the 70s. And then lastly, to Mike's point about Bevanism, well, the answer is yes. And I think perhaps when we come to look at the left in the 70s and the 80s, and indeed later on, the issue of programme, but more importantly, the tendency of the Labour left to compromise with both the centre and the right in the interests of party unity. In other words, the idea of the soft left. But thank you for, you know, rather like a tennis shot, Mike, you've lobbed it up in the air, and I hope I've given you a slam back, because I think you and I both agree about the nature of the Labour left, particularly as Bevan, who was a, you know, a particularly, in my family, was something of a hero. You know, when we start to look more closely, I think we do find those tendencies towards compromise, and indeed the idea that loyalty to the party is more important than defending a principled position. And if any people currently around are interested in that idea, or you know, believe it has relevance, then there are plenty of discussion forums around the Labour Left Alliance that we can get to grips with that question. Anyway, thanks for the questions, comrades.